In the heart of the world's harshest deserts places, where temperatures shatter thermometers and sandstorms can swallow a caravan hold, there existed a survival method so powerful, so deceptively simple, that the nomadic tribes who used it treated it almost like a guarded secret. To outsiders, these desert travelers appeared superhuman. They could cross salt flats where entire expeditions perished. They could navigate dune seas that swallowed armies. They could squeeze out water where others saw only endless dust and death. For centuries, explorers, merchants, and even imperial agents tried to learn how these nomads survived journeys that should have been impossible. But the tribes had a rule passed down through generations. The technique does not leave the people. Some tribes even punished members for teaching it to an outsider. It wasn't just knowledge, it was leverage. It protected their trade, their territory, and their power. And today, most of the world has completely forgotten it ever existed. To understand why this forbidden method was so fiercely guarded, you have to imagine the desert not as a barren wasteland, but as a living, shifting battlefield. The dunes changed shape each morning, erasing trails and swallowing tracks. Dry winds drained water from the body almost instantly. Even camels, often romanticized as perfect desert animals, struggle without the right guidance. But nomadic tribes survived not by overpowering the desert, but by reading it like a giant map that only made sense to those who inherited the key. The lost method was based on a principle that modern survival manuals rarely teach. The desert hides water in plain sight, not below the ground, but within the air itself. The nomads developed a technique to harvest moisture from the desert atmosphere, using simple materials that every caravan carried. It wasn't magic, it wasn't luck. It was physics mastered centuries before scientists wrote it down. The technique began with something deceptively mundane: wool. Nomadic groups from the Arabian Peninsula to the Karakum Desert found that tightly woven wool mats, when exposed to the desert's dramatic temperature swings, could pull moisture from the air at night and release it as usable droplets by dawn. During the day, the desert heats to extremes, but at night, the temperature plunges rapidly. This sudden cooling forces water vapor in the air to condense on certain fibers. While most materials release heat too slowly or too quickly to form droplets, desert wool, woven in a specific pattern, could trap and cool air in tiny pockets, producing a thin layer of condensation by morning. The result wasn't a fountain, but it was water just enough to keep a person or a small group alive during critical parts of the journey. This technique allowed nomads to survive multi-day crossings that outsiders believed required impossible stores of water. No travelers, soldiers, or early explorers could understand how these tribes managed to walk for days without collapsing. The answer was lying on the surface, literally collecting on their camp materials overnight. But the wool wasn't the only part of the method. The real trick, the part that tribes truly protected, was the way they positioned their shelters at night. Instead of setting up small tents the way outsiders did, the nomads arranged their wool mats in angled shapes that forced warm air upward, pushing moisture-laden air toward the cooling surfaces. This increased condensation significantly. Some groups placed the mats between rock formations or dunes that naturally funneled cooler nighttime air across the fibers. Others dug shallow trenches and lined them with wool to allow a thin layer of dew to collect where it could be scraped, absorbed with cloth, or licked directly. It sounds primitive, but in an environment where a few mouthfuls of water meant the difference between life and death, this was a technology as valuable as gold. This survival trick became a guarded cultural weapon. tribes would refuse to demonstrate it to foreigners. Some even dismantled their wool traps before sunrise if outsiders were near, pretending that their water came from secret wells or the miraculous endurance of their camels. In desert warfare, access to water wasn't just a luxury, it determined which side lived long enough to fight. Nomads intentionally kept the method secret from invading forces, especially during centuries of conflict when empires tried to control trade routes. It wasn't unusual for an outsider to travel with a desert caravan for weeks and still never learn the technique fully. The tribes made sure that the most crucial details were passed only to sons, nephews, or chosen apprentices. To everyone else, the desert's invisible wells remained a mystery. Generations later, as modern wells, tankers, and metal canteens became common, the practice slowly faded from daily life. Nomads transitioned to new tools, new routes, and new political landscapes. And with each generation that moved off the dunes and into settlements, fewer people remembered the old method that once ensured the survival of entire tribes. Today, only fragments of the technique survive, mentions in explorer journals, brief notes in old ethnographic texts, and oral stories from elders who recall their parents setting wool under the stars and whispering that the desert would breathe water into it by dawn. The irony is that modern survival experts often overlook the method entirely, even though it still works. In survival schools, students learn to dig for water or follow animal tracks, but few are taught to pull water from the air itself using the desert's natural temperature cycles. The original technique was sustainable, simple, and required no modern tools-only knowledge that has nearly disappeared. Scientists who study atmospheric water harvesting today used principles almost identical to what ancient desert nomads practiced, but with modern materials and machines. What was once lost knowledge is now being rediscovered as cutting-edge technology. And that is the fascinating part. The method wasn't erased because it failed. It was erased because it was too effective, too valuable, too strategic to be shared openly. In a world where survival meant controlling not just food or territory, but water itself, knowledge was power. Water knowledge was the greatest power of all. The nomads understood that the desert gives nothing freely, but it rewards those who listen. Their survival trick wasn't a secret spell. It was a quiet understanding between human beings and the land they walked. By the end of this video, you now know the truth behind the forbidden technique that kept generations alive in one of the deadliest environments on Earth. They didn't fight the desert, they partnered with it. They learned its rhythms, its temperatures, its invisible cycles, and used them to harvest water from the air itself. What outsiders saw as miracle or myth was simply mastery, ancient engineering perfected through generations of trial, error, and survival. And perhaps the most haunting question is this: how many other survival methods, equally powerful, equally forbidden, have been lost in the sands of time?